Hey there, welcome to another episode of The Poor Man's Workshop. In today's video, we're gonna turn all of these hardwood offcuts into one giant end grain cutting board. So the story behind these two big boxes is when I first started woodworking, I would actually go and raid local cabinet shops and their bins for offcuts of hardwood and nice wood. I got a big collection up. I thought I was gonna do a ton with making cutting boards and selling them. And well, these two boxes have now sat in my shop for close to 3 or 4 years. So for these, we're gonna make kind of a chaos style cutting board thing that's gonna go over the top of our burners on our stove. My first step is I'm going to split these up into different species of wood, and then we'll need to joint and cut them so that we can glue them up correctly. So let's get going. So over time, I was able to collect a large amount of walnut, maple, ash, white oak, red oak, and a little bit of aromatic cedar. Now, most of these species of wood are really good to use when making cabinets, but they're also really good for cutting boards. So we really lucked out with this project. There really wasn't any cost to me besides the cost of the space that it took to hold on to these boxes for the last couple years. So just a couple things on the different species of wood we've got here. Probably won't use the red oak. I'm not a big fan of red oak for cutting boards. And same with the aromatic cedar, it's just a little too soft. So a lot of people don't like to use white oak for cutting boards because of the really deep grain pattern that white oak has. I think that it's fine in this application because we're only gonna be using, it's gonna be the end grain. So we're gonna be using little blocks of white oak throughout the whole cutting board. And I like white oak and we have a ton of it. So that'll be really good. I'm really excited about all this walnut. That is awesome. Let's get all of these boards all jointed and cut up so that we can get gluing. The nice thing is that at one point while I was collecting all of this wood, I actually went through and cleaned up 2 faces of each board that I had up to that point. So I saved myself a lot of time. So here I actually went through and figured out which boards had clean faces already and put them aside, and then started on the milling process for all the other boards. I did this by marking 1 face of each board before putting it through the joiner. And then I also jointed 1 edge on some boards because some were a little too thick and I needed to trim them down on the table saw anyways. After the joining was done, I took them all over to the planer and sent them through the planer. Prior to this, I just installed some new knives on my planer, which made a huge difference in making this process quick and easy, and gave it a super smooth finish to make my gluing up a lot easier. All right, so we got all the joining and planing done of all these pieces. So what we're gonna do next is we're just gonna line them up and get them all matched up in kind of a design that we want, but we're just gonna line them up and create a pattern and then mark each panel. Each panel is gonna be 12 inches wide because my planer is only 12.5-inch wide planer. And then I'll also trim down some on the table saw. But that's what we're gonna do now. Let's get them all marked up and put in panels, and then we'll get to gluing. For this part, there really is no method to the madness. Some boards are longer, some boards are shorter. I tried to match them all up based on the length of their board, but I didn't want any specific pattern because this cutting board is considered a chaos style cutting board. I actually tried to make sure it didn't look too uniform. The main thing that I did is making sure no 2 species of wood were next to each other. And then I just marked across the face of the panel so that I would know exactly how the panel needed to be glued up. One tip when doing something like this is to include a couple long pieces in each part because the long pieces will help to reduce any sort of planer snipe. After getting all those organized, it was time to do the first of 3 glue ups. Now, this is just a typical glue up like you would do a normal edge grain cutting board. I use Titebond 3 in any sort of cutting board that I do because Titebond 3 is a waterproof glue versus the Titebond 2, which is only a water-resistant glue. I was definitely at my clamping capacity when it came to all these panels. I ran out of clamps, and that just goes to prove a woodworker can never have enough clamps in his shop. With the 6 parallel clamps and other pipe clamps that I had to actually do this process about 3 different times. Make sure you go and subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell if you haven't had an opportunity. That way you'll be notified anytime I've got a new project that goes up on the channel. All right, so I got all the scrap wood all glued up. So the next thing we're gonna do is plane both sides of these so we have 2 good reference surfaces. And then we're gonna cut each one of them into 1.5 inch strips, because 1.5 inch is the thickness that our edge grain cutting board is gonna be. We'll see how many strips we can get out of all of this, and that'll kind of determine really how big our cutting board is gonna be. We'll be using our crosscut sled to be able to cut these strips properly and make sure that they're squared up, so it makes our gluing up and our sanding and the final step really easy. Like I mentioned before, I intentionally made each one of these panels only 12 inches wide because my planer is only a 12.5 inch wide planer. But the process is pretty simple. I just cleaned up both sides on the planer. All the panels didn't have to be a uniform thickness because it's a chaos style cutting board. Really, it didn't really matter that much how thick each one ended up being. Next, I set the stop block on my crosscut sled to 1.5 inches so that I could trim all of the boards into 1.5 inch strips. It's really nice having a crosscut sled for any sort of project like this. I do plan on making a video on how I made my crosscut sled. I just haven't got around to it yet. But having a crosscut sled with a stop block on it made this process really painless and really fast. Next, it was time for another glue up. So I arranged half of the strips that I had cut onto 2 of the clamps and then just flipped every other strip over, creating more of a checker pattern rather than any sort of uniform pattern. Then I just flipped them on their side and glued them like I did in the first glue up. Pretty simple, huh? So I'll be gluing 2 panels like this that will make up the thickness of my cutting board, which will be about 21 inches wide and 28 inches long. And don't ever forget to dance while you're gluing, because it actually makes the glue dry quicker. It's important to use plenty of glue when doing a cutting board of this size. You want to make sure there's plenty of squeeze out towards the middle of the cutting board. So make sure you use plenty of glue and don't be stingy. If you're planing and cutting on the crosscut sled is all good, you shouldn't have to use a whole lot of clamping pressure, but I like to use these support boards to make sure that the pressure is distributed throughout the cutting board and not just down the middle where it'll crack. Now that both panels are glued up, it's time to chisel off any excess glue and get these things rough sanded so that I can joint and cut them to their rough dimensions and glue them together. For the sanding, I used my trusty downdraft table that's built right into my assembly table. If you haven't seen my assembly table build, I highly recommend it. The video will be linked above as well as down in the description if you want to check it out. This downdraft table has really been a game changer in my shop. Because you really shouldn't run edge grain through the planer, it's very dangerous. This is the best process if you do not have any sort of drum sander. After it was all rough sanded, I matched the 2 panels up to kind of decide what pattern I wanted it to be in and to mark the final length and width of the board using this tape measure that I hate. If it's not a lever lock, get it out of my shop. Once I knew my final dimensions, I marked it so I would know how to glue it up, and then I jointed it and ran it through the table saw to give me my final width. Obviously, these 2 panels will be glued together, and so the width of the 2 panels together will be my final width. All right, so we've got our 2 panels all sanded down and cut to the rough dimensions. I wanted to give you guys a quick tip. One thing that you'll notice when you do a glue up this big is that sometimes, even though you used your joiner correctly and your table saw correctly, you'll get a gap that goes down the center here, and it becomes unsightly, and it's really too much of a gap to be able to close with any sort of clamping pressure. So the best way to combat that is to actually flip the 2 panels on top of each other and run that edge through the joiner together. What that's gonna do is create 2 mirrored edges to each other that are perfect and that are gonna match up perfectly when you glue it. This one actually turned out a lot better than I thought it was going to, and so we're just gonna glue it up how it is. Let's do our final 3rd glue up and get this thing finished up. As you can see, this glue up is probably the easiest of all 3. You only have 1 part that you have to glue up. But it's important that you make sure that both sides are level, because if one is not level with the other, you're gonna have all sorts of sanding and leveling that you have to do afterwards. So take your time doing this. I also scraped off any excess glue that I could just to make the sanding process easier afterwards. Then I went over any of the imperfections and knots with a little bit of CA glue and activator from Starbond Adhesives. Once it was dry, it was time to get to the tedious task of sanding everything. Because end grain can be so rough, I started with 80 grit sandpaper, taking off all the excess CA glue and wood glue, and then proceeded to make sure that the whole board was level. I used a straight edge and a pencil to mark where there were high spots, and continued to use my 80 grit sandpaper until the whole thing was level. Because the last thing you want is a wonky cutting board when you're trying to cut something up. I completed this on both sides, making sure that both were level. Then I took the board over and cut it to its final length of 28 inches on the table saw. Then I added a small chamfer with my hand router. This is just to give it a softer feel on the hands, as well as to reduce any sort of chipping or tear out around the edges. Next, I wanted to add some little handhold coves on each side of the board to make holding the board a little bit easier. I did this using my edge mortising guide for my plunge router. I first started by putting the board up on end and securing it to my table, and then securing some stop blocks on each side of the board so I knew where to stop. I then plunged my cove bit into the board and went from one edge to the other, cutting slowly to ensure a good, clean cut as I go. This jig really helps to make sure that the cove is right in the center of the board, and really helps to make it so that you have a clean cut. I'll include a link to the jig in the description below. Go check it out if it's something that you could use in your shop. After that, it was time for sanding, and more sanding. I sanded the coves by putting a little bit of sandpaper around a dowel. I sanded the entire thing all the way up to 400 grit, periodically spraying it to raise the grain. And now it is time for my favorite part of making a cutting board, putting oil on it and getting it finished. I used a liberal amount of mineral oil because the end grain likes to soak up this mineral oil. But I love how adding mineral oil to this board just really makes the color pop. I went over it a couple times with mineral oil, allowing the board to soak in as much of it as it can. And then once it was all pretty much soaked in, I went back over it with my own mixture of beeswax and mineral oil. I covered the entire board with the mixture and allowed the board to sit there for 24 hours, allowing the wax to really set into the board. This will help to protect it from moisture, as well as gives it a little bit of sheen. After about 24 hours, I came back and buffed off all of the wax, and this cutting board was as good as done. Man, this thing is really gonna upgrade our kitchen. It looks fantastic on top of the stovetop, and it's nice because we can pick it up and move it anytime we use the stovetop, but we've got a massive cutting board to do some cooking on, and we're really excited how it turned out. So that's it for the video. Thanks again for watching. I'm really excited how this thing turned out. It turned out a lot better than I thought it was going to. I'm even more excited about getting all that scrap wood out of my shop so that I can make room for some other projects that are coming down the line. Make sure you go and subscribe to the channel and punch the notification bell. That way you'll be notified anytime we have a new project that goes up on the Poor Man's Workshop. Really, again, thanks for watching, and like I always say, never stop creating.